it's not a cold day in hell, but it's a cold day in the North Country. On December 17th, 2009, Minor Institute in Chazy, and my dear friend, Dr. Joe Burke. How are you?
Well, I tell you, it's warm always seeing old friends like you and Calvin.
We've looked forward to this for a long time, and you and I were commiserating before the cameras began, and we've known each other since the 70s. You first landed in Plattsburgh somewhere around 73.
Right? You got a memory, that's correct.
Well, I was in the news business in those days, and you were you were at the on the top 10 list of local celebrities in those days, and
things were hard up in those days.
You came to Plattsburgh State at a very volatile time in our nation's history, and you had some interesting things going on for the next how many years till 80?
I was 1 year as academic vice president.
I remember.
And then I became president in 73. I came as academic vice president in 74, and I went to Albany as provost in 86. So I was there 12 years.
You stayed here long enough to get a real flavor for this area.
Yeah, it's once in the North Country, you never get it out of your blood.
You know, we talk about it every day. Calvin and I mention quality of life on almost every show. I just did a 20-year retrospective for their Strictly Business magazine, and I look back over these forums that they have every year. Mm-hmm. And the business people talk about quality of life every single year, because we do have a lot to offer. We're sitting right here on a very historic piece of land.
Yes, surely were. This was founded in 1820 by William Minor's grandfather, who came and established a farm, 150 acres here in 1820.
And it grew exponentially over the years.
To a 15,000-acre fairyland farm.
Isn't that amazing? We've been fascinated by William H. Minor. Talk about people who've had an impact on the area, from the subject of philanthropy to farming, to agriculture, to railroading, what have you. And if there ever was a story about a local boy that makes good, it would be William H. Minor, huh?
Yeah, this is going to sound made up, but it's true. I mean, you know me, I don't make up things, right. Very often anyway. When I came here in 73, I heard some things about William Minor, and I talk about this in the book. I rushed to the library, the campus library, to get a copy of the biography, and I was absolutely astonished that one wasn't written. And I resolved to write one. That was 30 years ago. So
that's when you first thought about it?
Yeah, well, I first thought about it. And then I got involved in writing other things and other projects. So 30 years later, I began to do research on William Minor.
But you married this organization, and they married you. This has been a long relationship for you.
Yeah, I was, I guess I've been involved probably 25 years with it, almost as long as the college. Jim Fitzpatrick, who was chair of the William H. Minor Foundation that still funds the Chazy Central Rural School, the CBPH Medical Center, and the Institute, he got me involved early on. I was a trustee of the Institute. And when he was ailing at the end, he really chose me to be a trustee of the foundation, and also to be the chair of the board of the Institute.
And that's you're standing now. You've embraced it, and it has embraced you, and the fabric is interwoven in such a manner that you could never pull out of it.
Well, I often say, you can leave the North Country, but you never get it out of your blood. It's
in so many ways.
Yeah, I mean, you just have to see the lake and the mountains.
Yeah.
And in the beginning of the book, there's, I got my glasses out. I have a quote from William Minor about that I think rings so true about the North Country.
Read it to me.
He says, this was in Our Inheritance, the school magazine. Here's a man as busy as he was, always wrote the lead essay in the school magazine. And he said, "We have inherited this beautiful Champlain Valley, its lovely lake, its vista of mountains, its panorama of woods and fields and limpid streams, its restfulness, its neighborly feeling, its good citizenship, and its blessed remoteness from cities, those modern babbles where life is a jangle of mistakes and discords."
You know, he should know. He spent a long time in Chicago.
So this is Chicago versus Shazy. I mean, but I just think that's...
You know what? And those words ring true today as much as they did back then, because in spite of the fact that some parts of the North Country are a little bit more urbanized, we're still rural. Mm-hmm. We're still country. All you have to do is drive up the Ridge Road here and take a look across the lake or up in the mountains. We might see a few windmills that weren't here when he was here, but you know what? He would have approved of that, right?
Yes, sure.
And here was a guy. First of all, I want to show a picture of this wonderful book. And this way, this book was just published in 2009, early December, released to the public.
Just got it early.
William H. Minor, The Man and the Myth. What other picture could you possibly put? Could have had yours in a little small corner down here.
Well, actually, I do have mine, but it's fittingly small in the back.
In the back flyleaf.
Yes. Miner's like this, and Burke is like that.
Oh, and if you took the cover off, you'd never know it was there. How long in the making?
Well, I was trying to, you don't count when you're having fun. I really, I started thinking about it and began some preliminary research probably 3 years ago, but 2 years really rigorously.
People who've never tried to write much, even though they're avid readers, pick up a book and say, "Oh, that's nice," and have no idea. Blood, sweat, and tears apply.
Yes, it's actually. I talked earlier about going to the library and not finding it, and saying I was going to write one, and then 30 years starting to do it. And when I started to do it, I learned why one had never been done. For one thing, it looked as though there wasn't a great deal of manuscript material, and if you're doing a biography, you really want it to be based on his letters and memory. Well, we discovered a trove of letters and documents. A lot of it was here, in vaults, down in basements, up in attics, and we found them. But also, the law firm in Chicago, it turned out, had just a trove of material that no one had seen. The Alice T. Minor Museum discovered they have a great archives there, a lot of information. But another reason that had not been done is, it almost would require a polymath to write about Minor. He was an engineer, he was an inventor, he was a farmer, he was an educator, or what wasn't he? And who in the world would have the breath? Well, no polymath came forward, so I finally had to write it myself.
It fell on your feet, huh?
But you fall in love. Dolores Kearns, who did the book on Lincoln, a thing of rivals, I forgot the first word, she says that she could talk. She had conversations with with Abraham Lincoln. I think if you asked me what William Minor would think about anything, after thousands of letters and memorandum and so forth, I think I pretty well could tell you what he would what he would say.
I would imagine in your reverie, you probably, at least in your mind's eye, you did have conversations with him. You begin to think like the man. It's like adopting a persona on the stage. You have to begin thinking like the person in order to write about him, in order to write well.
The biggest difficulty, turns out just tons of material. My wife wondered where I was all the time, and I was stuck.
How is Joni doing?
Oh, she's doing fine. As lovely as ever, and I probably ought to read the dedication.
I think you should, yes.
To Joan Thompson Burke. Her contribution ranks first in this book as it long has in my life.
I love it.
That goes to her.
You're my man, Joe.
But the most difficult thing was, I had tremendous materials, was to separate the man from the myth.
That's the point.
Yes, the myths about William Minor are incredible, just incredible, and I'll talk about that tonight and today. So I won't go into that. But separating the man from the myth was the most difficult thing. And part of it is this is the most famous picture of William Minor. Well, I went back and looked at the press, the Sentinel and the other paper that were this was the picture they always used, and that comes down to today. Now, there are some other pictures, much younger, and I have some in the book. But look at that. Look at that picture of William Minor. There you can see a myth in the making. Here's a guy with his turned down mouth, that glaring eyes, and he says to you, look, I know what to do. I have the will to do it. And so that looks like a myth in the making to me.
Sure.
So the biggest part then was to separate the myth. And the other thing is, people here in the North Country, in Chazy, Clinton County, Champlain Valley, they didn't know anything about William Minor's business. They didn't know anything. The only thing they knew about was he was here as a young boy. When he left at 18, his Aunt Hulda said to him, "Will, be a nice young man, earn your pile, and come back."
They come back and see us.
So to 18, they talk about his life here on the farm. But when he left, everything grows vague. So they don't really know about how he worked as a bridge carpenter, how he became head of a car works, how his whole career, how he developed the company, and so forth, until he comes back in 1903 to his roots. And that's so.
We should tell people that he was born before the Civil War in
1862, and he died in 1930.
And he was an orphan. His
That's
parents died like 7 years apart when he was, what, 3
His
and
father, 10? His mother died when he was 4. His father when he was 10.
Yeah.
Came to live with his aunt and uncle, had not visited here before.
Yeah.
Now his aunt and uncle, and that's one of the myths, his uncle, here's this life of this man. Just think about this for a minute, on how the myth comes about. He was here on the farm. Then at 10 he eventually builds the leading railroad business, which still continues today as Minor Enterprises. He comes back, he funds Physicians Hospital, he develops a 15,000 acre farm. He and Alice do the Minor Museum, Hearts of Light Farm. He does all this, and then people just forgot about the work he did in his business. Now, so you would think, boy, that's pretty mythical, right? Well, Collier's Magazine in 1924, don't think that that's a big enough myth. So they invent. Now, his Uncle John was a mentor to him, but according to Collier's Magazine, his uncle beat him. And that's the reason he left, and he went to work.
I never heard that story. Come on.
He went to work in a stockyard. This was Collier's magazine.
Oh,
so
my goodness.
He's a classic case of what I call the American mobility myth. And that's the reason for all these myths. Now, what is the American mobility myth? After the Gilded Age of the 1890s, the great industrialists and so forth, nobody could believe anymore in equality of opportunity. But it was America. They've got to believe in you could become successful. And so what has become the classic American myth is the mobility myth. And the myth goes like this, that at least a few can make it from poverty to prosperity, rags to riches. And if they can do it, you can too. So that's the American mobility myth, and he's a classic case of this American mobility myth. And all of the myths about him really come from that. Now, some people say, why the negativity? There's so many myths. Well, the myths come from the mobility myth. But then why the negative? Why, for example, he stole the gear from a co-worker? When he left, he stole the gear from a co-worker, and the basic idea was that why have the negativity in that? Another one about him was that he had insisted on having the first hospital, or first operation in the hospital he built for a tonsillitis, to have his tonsils removed, and he died. He did die, and he did have it, but that was 4 years after the hospital, and he'd had the disease for 20 years. So
but that was a myth that persisted throughout.
Okay. So why the negativity in these myths? Well, the reason is, it goes like this. The positive side of the mobility myth is, if you can make it, I can too. But there's a negative tail on the mobility myth, and it goes like this. When you rise to great success, and I don't, why did success come to you, not to me? Now, it wasn't because I wasn't as talented or work as hard as you did, so it had to be a fault with you.
Sure.
You did dastardly deeds, devious things in order to succeed, which I would never do. So the mobility myth is, on the one hand, you can be fabulously rich, and if you can make that, I can too. But on the other hand, got to explain why you made it and I didn't. And it can't be because you're better than I am. And so that's the basis of all these tales. But the Plattsburgh Sentinel, when he died, I'll never forget, their obituary ends like this: we are unlikely to ever see his like again. And the heck of it is, William Miner, who built a leading railroad car business, built it all himself, who Hearts of the Light Farm, the Miner Institute, Physicians Hospital, Shazy Central Row School, he did all that. The man is even more mythical than the myth.
That's true. Absolutely.
So I hope that one thing this book does is say, look, you don't have to have a myth about William Miner. The man himself is incredible enough.
He painted a picture, and you've repainted it. I don't know if you've taken the cosmetics off it or added them.
Well, no. In the first place, I don't, in writing a biography, one has to be really careful. There are things about William Miner that were not so nice. I mean, I'm not sure I want to work for him. Although one of the myths is that he fired people for drinking or smoking and so forth. There's only one person in all the study I've done that I think he fired. So that part of his myth. He did things his way. He wanted to control things. He wasn't big on consultation. He decided what he wanted to give. He gave great things, and actually, as I say at the end of the book, there's a line from Emerson that says he builded better than he knew. The conscious stone to beauty grew. So if you look at the Minor Institute, you look at the Shazy School, you look at the hospital and all the others, what was really missing was most people had to take over the conscious stone to beauty grew. The school, Minor ran everything. The school with strong school boards and support from the community. The hospital with strong support of leadership there in the community. They took it over. In the Institute, they took it over. Minor could start it, but you have to have participation and community support to make it go. So, you know, he built it better than he knew. These conscious stones for beauty.
He knew what his legacy would be.
Yes. Although, at the end, everyone must wonder, will this too last? You know, and when you're a one-man show, for example, every other great leader time, Morgan, Ford, Rockefeller, they all had lieutenants. They created a lieutenant. He never did. His company existed for 2 decades before he appointed a vice president. And then there was a woman he knew he could control, not because she was a woman. It was just he knew he could control. On the other hand, I mean, he was really forward thinking in something. He had 3 women who were important in his organization, and this was in the early 20th century. You just didn't see that. Take, for example, when philanthropy, the idea of using philanthropy for public schools like Bill Gates and Anna Casey today, nobody did that. Minor was the first one to do that. Not to give to colleges and universities, but to give to schools. And what he said is he believed, as Bill Gates, I think, does, that if you can help to shape the child, it shapes the country. And he was way ahead of his time in that. He was also way ahead of his time in the sense of he didn't stay in the headquarters in Chicago. He got out to see how his gears and his other equipment operated. And he'd send letters back saying, check on this gear, and he would often do a drawing, say, you've got to have this curve in the shoes, and he would have a drawing about how to do it. So his great side was, boy, was he hands-on. His bad side was he had his hands on too tight.
Yeah. But that's not an uncommon theme.
No.
That some of the personalities that we know. He was a forward thinker. He was a brilliant man and able to find solutions to problems that would boggle the average person. Mm-hmm. I don't know his politics.
Oh, he was rock rib Republican.
Was he really?
Oh, yeah. There's letters he wrote to Warren Harding. Now, when you read the letters, you would think, my God, didn't he realize that Warren Harding? Well, what we sometimes, you know, as for the audience, Warren Harding, of course, there were great scandals.
Oh, boy.
But what we forget is those didn't become known until almost by the time Harding died. No, but William Minor hated taxation, hated regulation. He didn't care whether that regulation came from Washington on the Potomac or from, you know, New York on the Hudson, Albany on the Hudson. I mean, he hated it. He wanted to do things his way. And, of course, that was a negative side with him, I think.
He came, you know, there is such a thing as being in the right place at the right time. And, you know, he came forward in the late 1800s and in the early 1900s, another very interesting time in our nation's history.
Yes.
But I wonder what he would have been like either before or after that period of time?
I think he would have been different, I assume.
They wouldn't allow him to do some of the things that he did in this day and age.
Well, let me talk about that. I've written another talk. I don't know when I'll give it. I was thinking maybe I'd like to.
Right here.
I think I would like to give it back at Plattsburgh. I'm giving a talk on the minor myths, and I'm giving one at the museum on who was the real creator of the Shazy Central Rural School. But this other talk sort of gets at what you're saying. It's called William H. Minor and the Making of the American Century. You know, he was at that period where the making of American century. When he born in 1862, the United States was a fourth-rate nation. By the 1890s, 1900s, we were producing more iron and steel than Great Britain and Germany. I mean, we just hadn't thought of it. And so I've tried to probe into, if your question is if he was alive today, the difference with him in those days, and Americans of those days, is they believed the future was on their side. And they believed they could change things. I worry that we've lost that kind of confidence. We seem to have stalemates. The country gets divided on many, many things. And part of it is that we're afraid about change instead of seeing changes on our side. That's where the entrepreneurialism, the drive, that's what made the United States different from any other country in the world. The real question, and I wind up this talk saying that if we don't get that back, this thing that the future's on our side and that we can change things as a country if we don't get it back, then the American century, the 20th century, will be the last instead of just the first of the American century.
You know, I think that is a legitimate concern. It probably behooves all of us to think about what you just said. You know, it's hindsight is 20/20.
Yeah.
And being right in the midst of all this upheaval and contention and so on that we're in right now, as we're in 2009 and ready to turn another decade over.
Yeah.
I didn't know if I'd make it to 2000, and here we are. We can barely remember Y2K. But it behooves us to get a little perspective now. I think you're right. And to think about those things regardless of your politics.
Well, you know, we get so uptight. Is this the right thing?
Yeah.
Is it perfect? My God, in William Minor's day, they tried things. And if it didn't work, then they did something else.
The $1 Million Dam is a perfect example.
Yeah, well, and there's a whole thing in the book about the $1 Million Dam. But, you know, there's a place in the book where I'm trying to remember the exact, it's funny, you know, but it's 550 pages.
Sure.
So I know what it was. At one point in his life, we think of him as being innovative, and he was, except they wanted railroad company, and he was big on taking care of your customers. Gosh, he was way ahead of his time, and that's where he was out on the road meeting with customers. So one big railroad wrote and said, we want to buy parts to the draft gear. One of his favorites. By the way, we talk about that one invention. He had 85 personal patents himself, so he didn't have to steal it from somebody. Anyway, they wanted to know how much it cost for the parts because part of the shoes for this draft gear had gone bad. Now, William Minor had a rule. He didn't want to sell parts for repairs. Why? He wanted to sell the new gear. Now, now David Withall, who's president now of Minor Enterprises, said to me, and he sort of tutored me because I don't know anything about railroad cars. He said, nowadays, they repair them all the time and they make money and the people are happy and it's over. Amelia Minor, that was his mine. He didn't allow gears repairs. Then he wrote a book a few years later called, Draft Gears and Railroad Economics, where he talks about repairing gears. Now, the thing about William Minor, he never went back and explained why he didn't at one time. When he changed his mind, and that was it. So he would never admit and go back and plow over it. But when he saw that things had changed, he was willing to change. Now, I said he was Rockwood Republican, and he hated regulation. What he didn't understand was people don't like paternalism, whether it's from William Minor or it's from
Absolutely.
the governor in,
Sure.
in New York and Albany or the president in
Isn't
in
that
Washington.
amazing? That's amazing.
You sometimes wonder, how can a person be so far-seeing and yet so narrow? But when he became convinced, he didn't go back and say, "Oh, I changed my mind because such and such and such." He just went with the new thing.
How much of the myth was involved Alice?
Well, Alice, the view on Alice is, and she's a fascinating person. He died in 1930, and she lived in 1950, so she would have been she was a year younger than he was. I think she was maybe 89 when she died. So people will remember her. That's 20 years after he was, and they remember her as this old person, but that's not the way she was when he first met her. They met in 1893 and got married in 1895. That was a quick romance in those days. And the love letters he wrote her, people will have to. I have a lot of quotes in this book. I hope anybody that reads it loves quotes, but they're quotes by William Minor.
That's the only way to do it.
That I want them to see what William Minor. So he wrote a letter. He's always traveling the country. So he's out and he's tripping. In this trip, I think he traveled 2,500 miles on railroads selling his gear. This is early on before they're married. And he writes to her and says, how does that go? He's talking how much he misses her, and this is in the solitude of his desire for her. But coming back to Alice, Alice had a sense of humor and a wit, and she sort of lightened up William Minor, so that she brought a kind of effervescence. Now, she had to be an unusual person. I mean, he was gone all the time. She was a great reader. I think got him to be a great reader. His letters show he really paid attention to her advice about things. Everybody sees her later on. Well, yes, I want everybody to know that I agree with that. So,
yes.
Joni, you know I do.
I love it.
But she was a very, unfortunately, everyone remembers her from the end and not how she was. I think she got him really interested in literature, which he became very interested in. But I don't think he was at first. So she was a perfect, and he dearly loved her and missed her.
Isn't that very interesting? And when you talk about Alice T. being misunderstood in the later years,
Mm-hmm.
and history remembering her.
Well, they
true.
see her as a bridge-playing person who, was kind of flighty and didn't. I mean, that's just
true
not.
of so many females in history that I can recall. Eleanor Roosevelt, for example.
gosh, she was tremendous. But that was a different age. But even then, that was unusual.
Yeah.
That was unusual. But Alice, the interesting thing about William Minor, unlike Carnegie, Ford, the great philanthropist, he never put his name on any of his philanthropies.
I know.
Did you ever think of that?
Yep, it is.
But Alice,
about it.
when she created her museum,
yes.
she put her name on it.
Exactly.
This was her space, and she was going to put her name on it. So there's a whole side to Alice that when you read her letters, and by the way, there's some great letters between William and Alice, and they're in the archives of the Alice T. Minor Museum.
You know, I think it's so...
I think Amanda Palmer, the curator there, director curator, has in her blog, I think she's printed some of the letters. Alice really needs to be better known. That's again another myth.
Well, it's a package.
Yeah.
It's a package. Our lives are packaged with our wives. We joke about it, but it's absolutely true.
I mean, they were separate so much, but their letters always talked about they couldn't wait till they were back together.
Supporting each other and who they are. I think it's absolutely essential that you did this book at this time in history. And I don't know if Providence was on your side and you had the little William H. Minor angel on your shoulder, and whether he had horns or didn't at the time. But it takes inspiration to tackle a subject like this, and I don't know where it came from. Do you? Except the man's life itself.
Joni says that I'm sort of driven all the time anyway. And by the way, she says she's going to divorce me unless I get another project quick now that this is done. But the William Minor and the future, I just think, coming back to what I said, he believed, and people in those days believed that change was on their side. And he was deeply conservative. But there was a difference between William Minor and conservatives today. And the difference was really this. He believed that true conservatism was that you keep what you can and you change what you must. The conservatives we got today just believe they want to hang on to everything, and they don't realize that change and continuity is the necessity in politics and government or whatever. If the United States is going to continue in the 22nd century to be leader in the world, as we have been in the 21st century, if we're going to continue, then we have to, yes, conceive and continue the things that have made us great, our belief in freedom, but we have to change what we must to just, the god Janus, the Greeks had this, face two ways, past and the future. This is the great thing about William Minor. He really believed in values, the old-time values, but he also believed in change. And he wanted to help to make that change. And we've got to recover that spirit. We're good at hanging on sometimes, but we're not good at facing the future and change. So change and continuity is really...
I think a lot of people watching this program are not familiar with the life of Minor. They know the places here. They brought their kids up here at one time or another. They like to see the bison up on the corner, et cetera, et cetera. But
I'm the guy that killed the bison, by the way. We had to get rid of it. But anyway, that's another story.
But a lot of those people have not even thought about the man, let alone the myth about the man. So this book is a revelation. I'm sure a lot of things were open to you as you got into this book and found that there was a lot of memorabilia. There were a lot of things written that he wrote, a lot of things that you had to work with. But the book was opened for you before you ever got it down on paper, wasn't it?
Yeah, you when you start out, my view of William Minor, he was interesting, but it was in a superficial kind of level. I actually, when I had a title which wasn't very good when I first thought about doing, 30 years ago. It was William H. Minor, The Last of the Feudal Barons, because I was thinking about.
Oh, yeah. Sure.
But that was a superficial thing, and now, a biography shouldn't just recount the past. It should say something to the country about its future, and that's what William Minor would say today, I think.
Yeah, he'd be happy with what he saw here.
He would love the technology. I mean, you talked
he
about.
He would, sure.
This would be
He'd
fine.
love it. He'd love solar energy. He'd love,
And I think he would say, let's again get that American spirit that the future is on our side, and
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because now it's got my head really moving. I think it's an important concept for people to at least think about, whether they espouse it or not.
Yeah. The leader is always going to believe in change.
Sure.
And he did. Now, he didn't want to change some things that he probably should. That's true of all of us.
I want to know what kind of help you had. Even though we're giving you 100% of the credit for putting this book together, sometimes you have to have a little help from your friends.
Well, my wife Joan, we were going to do this biography together. It was going to be Joan, and actually we did a couple of years ago, we did a paper at the New York Historical Society on William Minor, and Joan and Joe. We did it together, but Joni and I work differently. I sit in front of a computer all day and I write. I mean, if you're going to write, you have to write all the time, and then you throw a lot of it away and you change it. But after doing that for about 2 hours, it was our first session, Joni said, well, now she was going to go away because she needed it. And I said, well, wait a minute, we got 8 or 10 more hours here to go. So, suddenly we got the notion. But she was incredible. For example, my first thought was, I'm going to do this biography. I immediately thought that I'm going to have a chapter on the business, I'm going to have a chapter on the dams, I'm going to have a chapter. That was totally wrong. She said, that won't work. That a biography, and particularly of William Minor, the really incredible thing is how he did all these things at the same time. He ran this farm, he did the business, he did the dams, he's thinking of the school. And that you have to write it as William Minor lived it. So that was incredible. This book would not have been what it is. She was absolutely right. As soon as she said it, I knew this is it. So she gets, my dedication to her is more than just preserving domestic peace. It really is heartfelt. I mean, she's it. People at the Institute, Rick Grant and Kirk Beatty, have just been great. Amy Bedard, the librarian, everybody here at the Institute. I mean, I've been, Kelly Snide, who's doing Czech here on Saturday, or it was Sunday, I think, saw the light. I was down in the farm office, down in the vault where there's letters down there, and it's, of course, I got a master key, and he's on the watch, and he sees his light, and he comes down there.
I love it. You're lucky you didn't get shot, Joseph.
So everyone has really been great, but then you have to sit down in front of that, and the greatest thing of all, of course, is William Minor. Without a subject like that. I wish William Minor were better known, not just here.
Yeah.
But
well,
all across the country.
We say that of all of our North Country history. Remember, we've talked about this North Country as being the best kept secret in the world, yeah. The sleeping giant, et cetera, et cetera. Those doors are opening now, and
I hope
this is your contribution.
Well, I hope so.
So who's reviewed it? Anybody?
No, not yet. I think I know there's going to be a review in the Press Republic. It just has come out, so I haven't really.
Well, when you said you wish he would become better known, there are ways you can get this book to people who can read it and say, "Oh my gosh!"
Well, I hope so.
I hope so too. You spent a few years of your life on it.
Well, that's.
But it's an important work.
Yeah,
it's not just to satisfy you.
I think it. By the way, let me just tell one story. Minor put over the storehouse. There's a big sign which we put back, by the way, for the heritage exhibit called "The Spirit of Hearts of Light Farm."
Yes.
And it has a whole series of maxims. It's real.
They're all over the place.
It's vintage William Minor.
Oh, yes.
And I knew I wanted to do this because when Joan and I were involved writing a little thing about that exhibit, I then was over walking along the halls here, and I saw that a staff member, and more than one, had tacked that up on the wall in their office. And so I think he's got something to say today.
That's wonderful, Joseph. I know you have another presentation which we'll be recording for posterity. It's so great to see you again.
To see you.
So great to see this book.
Oh.
It's an important work, and I hope it's viewed that way in the future. We'll come back and do it again.
Oh, yeah, good.
Thanks again, Joe. Okay. Great to see you. Say hi to Joni for me.
Calvin, it's good seeing you too. Well, thanks everybody for coming. I had so much help on this from all of you, too many really to mention, but I did want to thank Rick Grant, not just because he's the president of the Institute, but also because he, from the very beginning, had really encouraged me to do this. To take on a project of this size really requires somebody to encourage you, because I've been at this now for about 2.5 years. So that takes a lot of encouragement. And Rick, sometimes when the chapters just wouldn't fit and everything, I had to remember that and any blame for the book, you get it. Kurt B. has really been supportive and worked with publishers. This is my 6th book, and the others, Josie Bass published them, and they were all about higher education, and I didn't have anything to do, but doing this one required a lot of back and forth and so forth, and Kirk has really been great with that. And Amy Bedard had to put up with me and put up with me sneaking in the library on Sunday. And by the way, Amy, where do you hide those damn keys now? I can't get in on Sunday and Saturday. I've got to mention Kelly Snide. I was down in the vault in the farm office. Kelly, was it Sunday? Was it a Sunday?
I'm not sure.
You came down there, and it was, I don't know, it was late at night or early in the morning, I forgot which it was, wondering what the hell was going on. There's somebody in the farm office at, I think it was 7 o'clock at night, down in that vault. I always put a board in there because I was afraid somebody was going to shut that door. Locked in. I spent really then 3 years living and reading William Miner's mail. And I think I know what he thought. I certainly know what he dreamed. And most of the dreams, his dreams were fulfilled during his life. The Hearts of Life Farm, the Central Rural School, his business, the hospital. But his lasting dream that he never accomplished was an education agricultural research institute. I think he would want me to say to you, it took 80 years to get there, but he thanks you for doing it. I don't know everything he thought, but that's one I think I can say for sure. William Miner attracted myths like a magnet. A bizarre encounter that I had in the Miner farm office will prove my point. I arrived early one morning for a meeting with Rick, and we're sitting in the farm office there at that table reading the Press Republican, and out of Laurie Miller's office there burst this big burly guy who had registered to ride a four-wheeler up in Flat Rock. He did not know me, and I certainly didn't know him. He strode up to me, and without preface, he said, "You know, Billy Miner was an Indian." I said, "You mean a Native American?" He said, "No, I mean a Cherokee." Without pause, he launched into a blizzard of Miner myths. "Would you please wait a moment," I said as I ducked into Kirk Beatty's office for paper and pencil, because I've been collecting these Miner myths then for 2 years. Well, this fellow certainly looked like a prime informant, though not the kind of reliable scholarly sources that one usually looks for. When I returned, the man claimed William Miner's Aunt Hulda was related to his mother, who was a Cherokee, and gave his grandmother's name. Well, of course, the claim was untrue, because Aunt Hulda's maiden name was Fisher, and the name he gave me was not Fisher. Moreover, even if Aunt Hulda had been related to his grandmother, her relationship to William Miner was through Uncle John, who was his uncle, so he wouldn't have been a Cherokee even if the guy was correct. Before I could finish writing that myth, this garrulous fellow added triumphantly, "You know, Billy Miner was a bootlegger," which was the way he made his millions. When I asked for details, he said, "Well, you know, Billy lived in Chicago, the bootlegger town." Then the fellow spouted a flurry of incredible Miner myths, way too many for me to recount now. I thought this raconteur had finally come to reality when he said, "You know, Billy Miner did not steal the idea of the tandem rigging." And I thought, God, finally this guy's come to his senses. Just when I thought the one-way conversation had moved towards saner grounds, he said, "You see, there was this card game in Chicago. Billy Miner was playing. And one of the big losers finally had a good hand, but after a number of bets, he needed $800 to call. So he reaches in his breast pocket and pulls out these sheafs of papers with drawings and details on them, and says, hands them to people in the game and says, "Loan me $800. Well, every one of the other players didn't even look at them, but Mr. Miner takes them, studies them carefully. Everyone's kind of waiting and looking, well, come on, Will, let's get this game going. He still studied him, and finally hands him back and gives him $800. Well, the guy lost the hand. 2 aces to 3 kings. For me, the incredible claims of this fellow added to the horde of minor myths. Their sheer number raises the obvious questions: why so many myths about William Minor nearly 80 years after his death, which is historians, centuries count, but 80 years is not that long. Lots of people must have known him. But a second, even more perplexing question is why so many of these myths are negative about a man who did so many great things. How can all this happen? So today I want to explain a few of the main myths and propose some reasons for their creation, and suggest why so many of them are so negative. In the first place, creating myths about William Minor seems superfluous because his actual accomplishments are nothing short of mythical. His life from 1862 to 1930 represents what I call a classic case of the American mobility myth, perhaps the most persistent myth in American history. That myth showed that success in America after the chasm between the rich and poor of the Gilded Age could still depend, in a few cases, not on who you were, but on what you could do. On deeds, not birth. William Minor was born in Juneau, Wisconsin, then on the edge of the American frontier. His father was a transplanted Easterner, chasing the classic American dream of moving up by moving west. Yet his dream soon faded when faced with the realities of Western life. He worked as a part-time farm laborer during harvest and a carpenter in off-season. He never owned a home, and probably, though I can't prove this, not a home. William Minor's mother died when he was 4, his father when he was 10. His Aunt Hulda and Uncle John, imagine a 10-year-old goes to live on the Minor farm, never been there, and not met his aunt or his uncle. Homestead near the tiny village of Shazy, in a remote northeast corner of New York State, which you know, that's for tonight, because some people don't know where they're living. Dora Oliver, another family who lived in Minor's home, depicted the place, and I do it at some length in the book, but she later wrote Will that the loft where he had slept at the top of the stairs was cold enough to freeze a dog up here. Will labored long hours tilling the soil of a rocky soil. His uncle had once written back about Wisconsin. They said there's one rock here where there's 500. And those of you who worked on the farm, you know that's true. He went to a nearby one-room school, not the one, by the way, that says that sign out there, and we've got to get that sign down that says that's the school he went to. That school was built a year after he left. It looks exactly like it, but I mean, I just hate to be a historian and have that sign say the wrong thing. Anyway, he went to that school when the weather permitted, and you can see the kind of weather it is now. There, he was taught by reading the McGuffey Readers. But he learned through them not just writing, not just speaking, but also American history and patriotism. They inculcated the values of honesty, industry, self-reliance, love of God and country, like the spirit of Hearts of Life Farm, which I'm so pleased to see so many of you copied and put in your offices. By the way, there's another one that William Minor poem quotes work as worship. So it would be nice if you put that one up too. Anyway, on reaching 18, Will had two choices, but staying on the Shazy farm was not one of them. At that time, in 1880, he could go east to toil in the woven mills at Lowell, Massachusetts, or west to work on the railroad. Staying on the Shazy farm meant stagnation. Going east or west to a city meant success in those days. Sometimes it seems similar to today, doesn't it? At 18, along with many American youths of his day, he went west to make his fortune. He started as a bridge carpenter on the Wabash Railroad, then became a mechanic apprentice in Minneapolis, working 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, going to school at night, and often working on Sundays. He attended, you can see, work as worship was his life. He attended drafting courses at the Artisan School of the University of Minnesota. And often another myth is he graduated from the University of Minnesota's engineering. It wasn't engineering, it was in the Artisan School at the University of Minnesota. But along with most of the mobility myths of his day, he never achieved a college degree. Nonetheless, he climbed from chief draftsman of the to superintendent of railroad car works to master builder of a refrigerator car company in Chicago. And by the way, when you look in the book, there's a great picture in there. And instead of putting it in the backs in the sections, I've put it right in the place. He's 26 years old when he is named, and boy, is he filled with himself. He has this mustache, he's handsome, he doesn't look at all like this guy. And he's not as smart as this guy either at that time, as you'll see from the book. In 1891, the 29-year-old William Miner patented a tandem spring draft gear, which cushioned the shock and strain of railroads, one on each end. In the wooden cars of the day, 1 million cars eventually carried those gears, one on each end. In 1897, he opened an office in the Rookery Building, which has become, over time, one of the most fantastic buildings in Chicago. And in 1902, incorporated the W.H. Miner Company. So he'd been selling his gear since 1894, but one thing about Will, he decided he better have a day job as well. And so he didn't, he was selling his gear from 1894. And by the way, David Whittle counts the beginning of Miner Enterprises in 1894, but the company wasn't incorporated until 1902. Don't tell David that, he doesn't. Which sold a range of railroad appliances. It wasn't just gears, there were skims, there were door fasteners, there were all sorts of appliances. After losing their only child after birth, William and his wife Alice came back in 1903 to his Shazy roots. He transformed the old farm that was about 150 acres into a 15,000 acre fairyland farm called Hearts of Life. It drew visitors from around the world. It's incredible what they wrote about this paradise, perfection on earth. They came from Russia and China, Great Britain, lords and ladies came to see the wonders of Hearts of Life Farm. And he built a nationally renowned Shazy school. It was known throughout the country, this school, as being innovative for a country school of its day. Put the rivers Shazy, big and little, to work to bring the magic of electricity to the area. It's hard to imagine when Miner first came here, only about 9% of light heat came from electricity. By the 1950s, it was 55%. So electricity was the magic of the day. built a state-of-the-art hospital in Plattsburgh, 212 rooms. The head of the Mayo Clinic today came and raved about the place. That's before he was famous. My wife insisted. I say he then constructed the Alice T. Minor Museum, of course, which was his greatest accomplishment. Although the funny part about that is that she talks about, as she described the museum at the time, and it opened in 1924, she talks about the wonderful antiques that were there. He talks about the historical documents and the other items that were there. I'm sure she never saw that. Even now, 80 years after Minor's death, his foundation still provides the funding for the Institute, Shazy Central School, and CBPH Medical Center. Now, clearly, William Minor had all of the classic characteristics of the mobility myth. Tragic early death, a mother and father, the hard but loving life on the farm, the one-room school, the West, hard labor, night classes, sudden invention, and untold wealth. You would think that the Minor story offered a perfect mobility myth, but Collier's magazine in 1923 felt the need to embellish it. It had the article, that article had young Will, beaten by his Uncle John, run off to work in the stockyards in a slaughterhouse in the Chicago stockyards. For the American mobility myth, even Minor's myth wasn't big enough, wasn't good enough. It had to be embellished, it had to be more. So, God, it even started in 1923 before the man had died. Apparently, truth, however amazing, does not satisfy the American mobility myth. After William Minor's death in the 1930s, time and tale really started the myth. Collier's only began it. In the decades after his death, the image of William Minor has faded, and the myths have flourished. The myth has overpowered man. For what was true in the past often has less impact than what people now believe is true. Think about this for a minute. Men and women influence contemporaries, but myths persuade posterity. To understand William Minor's myth, we must probe the meaning of the American mobility myth. Myths are the matter that our heroes and our hopes are made of. We Americans love heroes, not so much for them as for what they mean to us. Our country has its own version of heroes. In the gallery of popular heroes in the United States, writes Roger Nash, the only rival of the frontiersman and his athletic surrogate is the self-made man. Sadly, girls, the self-made man was the only one. They didn't even talk about women until late in the 20th century. The self-made American hero rose from poverty to prosperity only on his own efforts, which tied determination to desire. The self-made American hero climbed from the bottom to the top. The lower the beginnings, the higher the wealth at the end, the better the mobility myth. No myth has lasted so long in American history as this myth about American mobility, which asserts that Americans must continue to believe in the possibility, however faint, of moving up, even from rags to riches. That myth allowed Americans to claim not who you were, but what you can do still determine success in our country. Now, I hate to spoil it, but scholarly research has shown in reality that American mobility has diminished, some would say even disappeared. Moreover, a long series of reports by those ideological opposites, the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, a few years ago concluded, and it's really a long series, that who you are, not what you can do, still paves the path to success in America. But something I want you to remember, myths are about beliefs, not facts. Beliefs, not facts. We believe myths because we want them to be true, and ignore facts because we fear to face them. When we consider the minor myths, negative and positive, which circulate in Chazy and Clinton County, remember that myths are the tales that speak to our hopes, but also our fears. William Minor's lonely and lovable Aunt Huldah voiced the hopes and fears of those dwelling in rural areas across the ages when she wrote just hours after young Will left the farm for the West in December of 1880. Will, she wrote, be a nice young man and go to work so you can earn your pile and come back. She knew that the hope of making a fortune meant leaving the North Country, but she also assuaged the constant fear that the young would never return by admonishing them to come back. How many mothers and aunts from rural communities across time, down to our own day, have written or felt those sentiments? You have to go, but come back. William Minor represents a classic case of the American mobility myth. Although the minor myths are many, don't worry, I'm only going to take a few. Let me mention and explain just 6 to show how they fit the American mobility myth. The first 3 are generally positive and stress William Minor's foresight, determination, and success. And here they are. Myth 1, that when young Will left the Minor farm homestead at 18 in 1880, he always planned to return, after making his fortune, to transform the farm into a model farm. Myth 2, that he conceived and created the Chazy Central Rural School. And myth 3, that he was one of the wealthiest men in the United States. None of these 3 are true. Myth 1 suggests that Will, as a boy, always planned to return and transform the homestead into a model farm. It shows that, this is necessary for the mobility myth, it shows that from an early age, he tied determination to desire. Essential characteristics of the American mobility myth that also preaches that the road to success must begin as a child at an early age. They taught that in school in those days. Now they want people to develop, freely and so forth. I'm not so sure which is the best approach to that, but anyway, they still taught it the old way when I went to school that long ago. The truth is that when the 18-year-old Will Minor left the farm in 1880, he planned to make his life in the West. He couldn't get out of Chazy fast enough. I won't say that tonight quite that way, but he wanted to go west. He made only 4 visits between 1880 and 1893. Or 1903, I'm sorry. 4 brief visits before his return in 1903. In 1897, 1903, yeah. In 1897, just 6 years before he came back, he planned to sell the old Minor farm. By this time, his company and career, his love and his life were clearly in Chicago, not in Chazy. Myth 2, that William Minor alone conceived and created the Shazy Central School. This myth fulfilled the requirement that the man in the mobility myth must work largely alone, unaided, to manage his own miracles with little or no outside assistance. Again, the claim is untrue. George Mott, a young Presbyterian minister, would you believe, from Brooklyn, conceived and created the innovative Shazy Central School, close to the Canadian border. Mott spawned the idea for a rural school in Shazy, identified the educational plan, recruited the teachers, and implemented the curriculum. William Minor did conceive of the wondrous building for Shazy, which became their Alhambra Palace. But William Minor, George Mott, not William Minor, conceived the school. Myth 3 speaks of William Minor's fabulously wealth. Now, this is the core gold of the mobility myth. Though it follows the dictates of the mobility myth, that's also untrue. Indeed, when he died, the National Depression and the decline in company sales had depleted his wealth. In addition, the rising cost of the Shazy School, and by the way, he paid almost all of it. He didn't just give a little money to it. The Shazy School, Hearts of Light Farm, and especially Physicians Hospital had far exceeded his foundation's returns on his patent investments and earned income. At the time of his death, the foundation owed nearly $1 million to the company that it had spent on these. $10.3 million this day. In addition, there was probably another $500,000 that were owed in debts at that time. He wasn't poverty-stricken, but he certainly wasn't wealthy. Yet, as late as 1970, in a very good History of Shazy by David Martin and Nell Sullivan, they said when he died in 1930, he was one of the wealthiest men in the United States. The fact that he wasn't may diminish William Minor the myth, but it surely elevates Minor the man who, though constrained, continued to do those great things. Still, as mentioned before, facts always fall before myths. Facts are utterly helpless when faced with myths. A real American mobility myth must not just be merely rich or wealthy, he must be fabulously rich. Otherwise, he cannot offer the great mobility myth to others. Fabulous riches are the hallmark of the mobility myth. Now, at least these first three, though they're not true, are positive. But the last three are negative. And why? Myth 4 claimed that William Minor insisted on having the first operation, probably unnecessary, in the physician's hospital that he built. Myth 5 contended William Minor was mean and fired workers for smoking cigarettes and minor faults. And finally, the most commonly heard Minor myth and most detestable of all, he stole the idea of the rigging from a co-worker. Younger than he was, by the way. Makes it worse. Okay, myth 4. That Minor insisted on having the first operation, probably unneeded, in the hospital he built. The only problem with that, it ignores two details. First, he had suffered from tonsil problems for 2 decades. His sister died from a complication with tonsillitis. So the illness may well have been a family trait. Not only that, he paid to have the tonsils removed for every kid in the school that couldn't afford to have it done. So he had a thing about tonsils. Second, his surgery occurred 4 years after the hospital was built. It was built in 1826 and he died in April 1930. He can do many things, but he couldn't do that. Therefore, his operation could hardly have been the first that occurred in that wondrous building. Myth 5. Evidence from hundreds of recently recovered letters show, and that are now in Amy's archives. And by the way, I need to know where that key is. From the Chicago law firm, it suggests that George Mott, the dean of the Shazy School, is probably, at least I can find no other, that William Minor ever found. Though he talked tough in letters and placards, God, you saw those letters. You smoke or you make noise after 9 o'clock at night, and we're going to dismiss you. He talked tough, but he didn't do it. Why do I think he didn't do it? Well, let me talk about the man who was headed his inspection team at Pratt & Letchworth, which manufactured his gear. Here's what he did. I'm just going to use 2 instances, but it made Miner's life miserable from 1925 down to his death. And he probably worried after that. The head of his inspection team at Pratt & Letchworth, Williams shipped flawed gear that was too big. And Miner had given as a present to the president of the B&O Railroad. His idea was he wanted to get the business of the B&O, which used competing gear. The gear would not fit into the pocket. And when he made a trip, or they called Pratt & Letchworth to say it wouldn't fit, and they said, that can't be true. We always measure all our gears. So when he goes to the B&O headquarters, the chief engineer takes him out to the yards, gives him a gauge, and says, measure your gear. This is, William Miner, that guy. He looked a little younger, but not much younger. Imagine the embarrassment. It's too long. And he had written letters about measure and measure. Okay, that guy did that. Then he followed it up, and I'm not even going to mention all the occasions. He followed it up by sending wrong size yokes, which ties into this mechanism, to the New Haven Railroad, which one of Miner's best customers that caused derailments. Miner never fired him. Now, if he didn't fire him, I don't know who the hell he did fire. I talked tough, but I think he couldn't pull the trigger. Finally, there comes the most celebrated. I know you've just been waiting for this. Persistent of the Miner myth that he sold the idea of his patent. Somebody just, Steve just said that his father told him that, Steve, where are you? Oh yeah, who did he say?
The guy who lives in Ingraham.
You gotta send me the guy's name. Anyway, it's many letters that he stole the gear. I quit counting long ago how many letters I read. But hundreds of them show that he had knowledge, clearly had the knowledge to be able to do this. And what is even greater evidence, and people don't even know this, that wasn't William Miner's only patent. He had 85 patents, personal patents, throughout his life. Now, a guy, he has 5, after his first patent came in 1891, and in the 1890s, he has 5 patents that he gets in that year. Now, a guy can do 5 patents in a decade. No, he doesn't need to steal the thing for a tandem gear. So how can this go on? Remember, myths always fall before facts. Now, okay, you say, well, that's not understandable. What about the negativity? That really troubled me too. It's especially surprising in a man who represented a mobility myth for others. If he's a model for others, how can you have negativity about that? That just seems incongruous, doesn't it? But the answer really lies in the ambiguity of the mobility myth and the nature of it. Such myths have a hidden paradox. The men, and it's always men, not women at this time, it only happened in the late 20th century. The myths must be good, not too good. Why not too good? Why this negative tail to this great mobility myth? Despite the attention we lavish on them, we Americans are hard on our heroes and our myths. Mostly because the mobility myth is more about us than it is about them. The hero must be better than most, but not so good as to kill the mobility myth. It has to be better than most to refresh the hero, the mobility myth, but not so good as to kill it. Now, the good part of the mobility myth suggests if he can do it, so can I. Yet, as those few heroes and myths soar to success, and I don't make it to my dreams, the question silently shifts. Why did success come to him and not to me? Bright side of the mobility myth says if he can do it, I can too. I'm uplifted. Dark side says, why him, not me? The characteristic of good but not too good fits both sides of the mobility myth. Our hopes on the one hand, our fears on the other. The pleasant part confirms the belief that the few can rise from poverty to prosperity. You can too. The bad part explains why the few succeed, often through dastardly deeds in devious ways that I would never do. The many explain away their shortcomings as not because they were less worthy or enterprising, but because they declined to do those devious and dastardly things that the succeeders did. As a result, a man in the mobility myth must be good, but not too good. William Minor got even more scrutiny because he was a homegrown mobility myth. And Holda expressed the hope for Will as the homegrown mobility myth, but in ours after he left the homestead in 1880. Will, she wrote, be a nice young man and go to work so you can earn your pile, and then at the end, the admonition, and come back. It contributed something special to the homegrown myth. The myth of William Minor became not just homegrown, even worse, it became home-centered. He not only went off to make his pile, he did an unusual thing for rags to riches heroes. He came back not just for triumphant visits, but to make life in the North Country in Shazy, Clinton County, in the Champlain Valley competitive with the best that was offered in the United States. He hoped to save the virtues and values of country living by developing a national model based on changing the outmoded institutions, the outmoded customs, and the age-old and wrong practices in Shazy, Clinton County, and the Champlain Valley. But, boy, community change has conflicting consequences. No matter how well-needed or well-intentioned, change can uplift the community but it always aggravates many citizens. Why? Because it forces them to change. All of us are great at insisting on change for others while vigorously resisting it for ourselves. Architects of community change always generate mixed feelings, mostly negative. Home-centered heroes get even more scrutiny than their absentee counterparts. Citizens see them up close, which allows more focus on their faults. Where the faults are few or not obvious, would you believe they are sometimes fabricated and circulated as rumors? Some suggest pettiness in the hero, such as William Minor insisting on having the first operation, probably unnecessary in the hospital he built. Others suggest a fatal flaw in the hero, such as stealing the draft gear from an underling who worked with him. Moreover, the newspaper stories of William Minor throughout his life, and I think I've read every one of them, suggest that local citizens knew little or nothing about his early work with repairing or building railroad cars, or even his railroad appliance business. For the mobility myth, all they really needed to know or believe about how life outside of Shazy and Clinton County was the untold millions he made and spent in their area. Yet inevitably, a few individuals, seeing the claim awarded to and the wealth acquired by this hometown hero, William Minor, rooted, why him, not me? They excused their failure by dismissing their hero's success as having been achieved by some dastardly deed, such as stealing an invention. Others who would never fabricate the falsehood repeated them as rumors. And what happens to repeated rumors? They become known facts. Moreover, benefactors and beneficiaries always have ambiguous relationships, no matter how much the benefits conferred. That ambiguity rises with the size and frequencies of the benefits. Communities and citizens welcome with gratitude the benefits that the benefactor brings them. Yet over time, they begin to feel some resentment at their dependency on others rather than on themselves. The many benefits William Minor brought to Shazy and Clinton County naturally produced some resentment, as well as benefits, but the resentment comes from the resulting dependency, as well as gratitude for Minor's gifts. His penchant for deciding which gifts to give and how to give them and controlling them also contributed to this. The public image of William Minor today comes from those portraits and the copies that hang in the school, the museum, the hospital, and yes, even here in the lobby next to the one of Rick, and I think I'm on the other side. Publications in the press usually use one of those pictures. Despite a number of photographs at various stages in his life, portraits like the one on the cover of my book show a stern, white-haired man glaring down at the viewer. They depict not so much a man as a myth in the making. The message of those portraits is clear. This man could do great things, but he was not nice. In reality, William Minor was not quite as great as he was, as the mobility myths pronounce. They're not nearly so bad as they proclaim. In the end, the needs of the American mobility myth for some citizens of Shazy and Clinton County demanded that William Minor be focused first and last on their area and richer than he really was. But conversely petty in his desires and willing to win success by stealing the idea for his first patent. The myth of William Minor are many, for they flow more from the need for mobility myth than the real characteristics of Minor the man. To suit the American mobility myth, William Minor must be pictured as good, but not too good. As a result, Chazy and Clinton County for nearly 80 years have missed the real greatness of William Minor, the man. For Minor, the man, even more than Minor the myth, proved truly larger than life. William Minor, the man, has gone for long. But his gifts live on in the Minor Agricultural Research Institute, the Chazy Central Rural School, the CDPH Medical Center, the Alice T. Minor Museum, the Kent Delord House, and in the Minor Enterprises. It is time for us to put to rest the myth about William Minor and to recognize his lasting contributions of Minor the man are far greater than the make-believe myths. The obituary in the Plattsburgh Sentinel, written the day after Minor died, spoke of William Minor, the man, not the myth, with wistful lament. It is doubtful we shall look upon his life again. Thank you very much.